This photograph was taken sometime in 1944, somewhere in the American Midwest. The exact hospital is unclear. The photographer is unknown. What we do know is what the image shows, and what it doesn't explain. A woman lies on an operating table, her body covered, her face barely visible under the harsh surgical lights. Around her stand American surgeons in masks and gowns, hands steady, instruments poised, but behind them, others watch, silent figures. Not doctors, not nurses. Who are they? Why are they here? And why is the patient not an American soldier, but an enemy prisoner of war? This was not a battlefield hospital. There are no explosions, no gunfire. Yet something about this room feels tense, almost forbidden. Why would American doctors spend hours performing surgery on someone they were trained to defeat? And what happened in this room that changed everything for the woman who begged outside the door? Please, just shoot her. November 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Margaret hit the wooden wall of the guard post with both hands. Once, then again, the sound flat and desperate against the cold boards. Her breath came in broken pulls that burned her chest. She could not get enough air. She tried to speak anyway. Please, she said, the word tearing out of her throat. Please, my friend, dying. The American soldier inside the post opened the door part way. He was young, no older than 20, his cap pulled low, his face already lined with confusion. He had been expecting a complaint about rations or a work detail gone wrong. Not this. Margaret leaned forward, gripping the doorframe to stay upright. Her fingers were swollen and split from weeks of laundry work. Her nails bruised purple where she had struck the wood too hard. She forced the rest of the sentence out in the only English she had. Shoot her, she said. Please. Mercy. The word mercy sounded wrong in her mouth, but it was the right word. It was the word she had been taught to use when suffering went too far, when a body became a burden. She repeated herself, quieter now, like a prayer she no longer believed would be answered. Shoot her. For a moment, the soldier only stared at her. He looked past her shoulder toward the women's barracks, then back at her face. He did not reach for his pistol. Inside the camp, the afternoon carried on as it always did. Gravel crunched under boots. Somewhere, a truck backfired. Wind moved through the bare trees along the perimeter fence. The world did not pause for what Margaret was asking. The soldier's hand went to his radio instead. He lifted it, fast now, his movements clean and practiced, and spoke into it with a sharpness that startled her. She did not understand the words, only the tone. It was not a question. It was an order. Within seconds, a siren broke the air. Margaret flinched at the sound, her shoulders tightening as if she had been struck. Sirens meant punishment. Sirens meant the end. She had heard enough of them in Germany to know what followed. Bombs, collapse. Death counted in minutes. But this siren did not mean that. It was higher, faster, urgent in a different way. Not the long woe of warning, but a signal that pulled people toward something instead of driving them away. A medical call. The meaning of the sound had changed, and Margaret did not yet understand how. Boots pounded across the yard. Voices rose, not in anger, but in clipped coordination. A vehicle engine turned over hard and moved, gravel spraying beneath its tires. The soldier at the post was already stepping past her, motioning for her to follow, his attention locked on the radio as if it were the only thing that mattered. Margaret stumbled after him, her legs weak, her mind lagging behind her body. They reached the laundry building just as two medics appeared from the far side of the compound, carrying a folded stretcher between them. One of them had his sleeves rolled up despite the cold. his hands already pulling gloves from his pocket as he moved. Another soldier followed with a canvas bag that thumped heavily against his hip. Inside, Elsa lay on the concrete floor where she had fallen. The other women had done what they could. Someone had slid a coat under Elsa's head. Another pressed a wad of cloth against her lower abdomen, both hands shaking as dark blood soaked through the fabric and spread across the gray dress beneath. The smell of iron hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Elsa's eyes were open, but they no longer focused on anything in the room. Her mouth moved soundlessly, her breath thin and uneven, as if each one had to be negotiated with her body before it would come. Margaret dropped to her knees beside her friend without thinking. She took Elsa's hand, cold and damp, and held it tight, as if grip alone might keep her there. "I'm here," she whispered in German. "I'm here." But she knew the truth even as she said it. She'd seen this before, on the road during the retreat, in barns and cellars and the backs of trucks. When the pain came like this, when the blood did not stop, there was only one ending. That was why she had run. The medics were already at work. One knelt beside Elsa, fingers at her neck, counting silently. The other cut fabric away with quick, efficient motions, exposing the wound without hesitation or ceremony. A needle flashed. A line was opened. Blankets were pulled around Elsa's body, not to comfort her, but to keep her warm enough to survive what came next. Margaret watched all of it in stunned silence. This was not what she had expected. In her world, mercy was final. It was a bullet given quickly so the suffering would stop. Medicine was for your own. Bandages were not wasted on enemies. Doctors chose who was worth saving. That was what she had been taught. That was what made sense. She had believed, with absolute certainty, that asking for Elsa to be shot was an act of love. As the stretcher was unfolded and Elsa lifted onto it, Margaret's hands shook so badly she had to press them against her thighs to steady them. The siren outside continued to sound, not fading, not slowing, but holding the space open, insisting that something could still be done. Across the Atlantic, the war was consuming cities by the week. Germany was burning itself hollow. But here, in the middle of Kansas, the machinery of another kind of war moved without drama or hesitation. Radios worked, vehicles arrived, trained hands followed drilled procedures. No one asked whether Elsa deserved this effort. They only asked how fast they could move. Margaret followed the stretcher as it rolled out into the open air, her mind racing to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. She had begged for death. Instead, the Americans had answered with speed, coordination, and care. Why? Why would an enemy do this? Why would a country already spending men, fuel, blood, and steel on a global war stop to save one German prisoner? Margaret did not have the words for the question yet. She only knew that the sound of the siren had broken something inside her, something she had thought was unbreakable. If victory was only about winning battles, this made no sense at all. But if it was about something else, about how power was used when it could afford to be cruel, then she needed to understand what kind of country she had fallen into, and she needed to understand it quickly, because Elsa was still breathing, and the Americans were fighting to keep it that way. August 1944. The heat came first. It settled into the wooden cattle car before the doors were even fully closed, thick and unmoving, trapping the breath of 40 women inside a space never meant for people. There were no seats, no windows, only narrow slats cut high into the boards, just wide enough to remind them that air existed somewhere beyond reach. Margaret stood pressed between two other bodies, her shoulder wedged against a woman she did not know. her back damp with sweat. The floor beneath their boots was already slick, the smell of fear and unwashed fabric clinging to everything. Every time the train jolted forward, someone lost balance and grabbed for whatever was closest. An arm, a sleeve, a braid of hair. They had been loaded quickly, shouted into motion by American soldiers whose words they barely understood. Hands up. Move. Faster. No one had been struck. No one had needed to be. The rifles alone were enough. When the doors slammed shut, darkness swallowed them. For a long time, no one spoke. The train began to move, metal screaming against metal, the vibration traveling straight through their legs and into their bones. Someone near the back started to cry quietly, the sound small and embarrassed, as if crying itself were a failure. Margaret closed her eyes and counted breaths. In, out, in, out. This, she told herself, was the beginning of punishment. She had known it was coming from the moment their unit surrendered in France. The Reich had been very clear about what American captivity meant. They did not follow rules. They did not respect honor. They were gangsters in uniform, men without discipline, without mercy. She had believed it because she needed to. Inside the darkness of the car, voices slowly emerged. Not loud, not yet. Whispers passed from woman to woman, the same stories repeated in different words. American camps where prisoners were starved until they begged. Experiments performed without anesthesia. Women humiliated to break their spirit. Medicine withheld because the enemy was not worth saving. "They will not waste supplies on us," someone said. "They will let us die." Elsa stood beside Margaret, one hand wrapped tightly around the strap of her small cloth bag. Her knuckles were white, her jaw set in a way Margaret recognized. Elsa always looked like that when she was afraid, too composed, too controlled. "They want us to fear them," Elsa said quietly. "That's the point." Margaret nodded, though her throat was too tight to answer. Fear made sense. Fear was familiar. Fear could be prepared for. Hours passed, then days. The heat gave way to cooler air at night, then returned with brutal insistence each morning. Food came irregularly, slid through the door in silence. Water was rationed carefully. No one complained aloud. Complaints were for people who expected to be heard. On the third day, Margaret managed to wedge herself close enough to one of the slats to see outside. She expected devastation. What she saw instead made her pull back sharply, as if the view itself had burned her. The countryside rolled past in wide, open stretches of green and gold. Fields spread out farther than she could see, broken by lines of trees and low barns painted red and white. A farmhouse appeared, then another, each with neat fences and porches that faced the road without fear. Children ran across a yard, chasing something small and fast, their laughter lost to the noise of the train but visible in the way their bodies moved freely. A woman hung laundry on a line, the white fabric snapping gently in the wind. Nothing was ruined. Margaret pressed her face closer to the slat, searching for signs she recognized. No bomb craters, no collapsed roofs, no burned-out shells of buildings. The land looked untouched, almost indifferent to the war that had consumed everything she knew. Elsa leaned in beside her. "Look at it," she whispered. Margaret did not answer right away. "How can they live like this?" Elsa went on, her voice tight, "while Bremen burns?" The question lodged in Margaret's chest. She had no answer for it. She could only watch as the train moved through a country that did not look like a battlefield, that did not look like a place under siege. The women took turns at the slat after that. Each view outside deepened the same confusion, towns with storefronts intact, roads filled with trucks carrying goods instead of refugees, farmers driving tractors across fields that stretched toward the horizon, uninterrupted. This was not what they had been shown. In Germany, the radio had painted America as decadent and decayed, a place of criminals and racial chaos held together only by brute force. But what passed before their eyes looked orderly, productive, calm in a way that felt almost obscene. "They must be hiding it," someone said. "They don't show us the camps." "They will show us soon enough," another replied. At night, as the train rattled onward, the propaganda returned with renewed force. The familiar phrases surfaced, rehearsed and reinforced over years. Americans were weak but cruel, rich but savage. Their abundance made them careless with human life, especially enemy life. Margaret clung to those ideas like a rope. Without them, nothing made sense. On the fifth day, the train slowed. The screech of brakes cut through the car, sharp and final. Bodies swayed, hands shot out to steady themselves. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. Margaret forced her way back to the slat. Guard towers rose into view first, stark and angular against the flat sky. Then the fencing, layers of it, wire upon wire, stretching across the landscape with mechanical precision. Beyond that, rows of wooden barracks stood in neat formation, painted a dull green that blended into the surrounding fields. Camp Concordia. The name meant nothing to her then. It would come to mean everything. Elsa leaned close, her breath warm against Margaret's ear. "There it is," she said. "This is where it begins." Margaret's stomach twisted. The camp looked too clean, too organized. That unsettled her more than any sign of chaos would have. This did not look like the places from whispered stories. It looked planned, permanent. The doors of the cattle car slid open with a jolt, daylight flooding in so suddenly that several women cried out and covered their faces. American soldiers stood outside, rifles slung but ready, their expressions controlled, unreadable. "Out," one of them said. "Line up." The command was firm, not shouted. It did not need to be. Margaret climbed down from the car on legs that trembled beneath her. The sun hit her face hard, forcing her to squint. The air smelled different here, dry, dusty, mixed with something she could not name. Not smoke, not rot. Something cleaner. She took Elsa's hand without thinking. They stood together as the rest of the women disembarked, forming a loose line under the watch of the guards. No one struck them. No one mocked them. The restraint itself felt ominous. This, Margaret thought, was how real cruelty began. As they were marched toward the gate, she fixed her eyes on the barbed wire, on the towers, on the armed men above. She forced herself not to look at anything else, not the distant fields, not the sky. She told herself the same thing again and again, the way she had been taught. This is the enemy. This is where mercy ends. This is hell. By the time they reached the gate, Margaret had already decided what she would expect, and what she would never ask for. The first thing Margaret noticed as they passed through the gate was the smell. It reached her before any order was given, before her eyes had time to take in the layout of the camp. It drifted across the open yard in slow, undeniable waves, settling into her chest and tightening something deep in her stomach. Meat. Not the thin, gray smell of ersatz soup or boiled scraps. This was rich and heavy, the scent of fat-meeting heat. It carried warmth with it, and beneath it something else, fresh bread, the kind with a crust that cracked when broken. Margaret swallowed hard. Her body reacted before her mind could stop it. Her mouth filled with saliva, her knees weakened, and for one disorienting second, hunger eclipsed fear. "It's for the guards," she whispered to Elsa without looking at her. "It has to be." Elsa nodded quickly, as if the explanation needed no further thought. But the smell followed them as they moved deeper into the compound, growing stronger instead of fading. It did not stay politely behind the fences where guards belonged. It moved freely, confidently, as if it assumed the right to be there. Sound joined it next. Not shouting, not barking commands. Voices carried easily across the yard, relaxed and unhurried. Someone whistled, a light, careless tune that Margaret did not recognize. A radio played somewhere. The music, bright and unfamiliar, full of brass and rhythm. Jazz, though she did not know the word for it yet. The kind of music they had been told was forbidden, degenerate, corrosive. Here it simply existed. The women were formed into lines with efficient gestures and brief instructions. No one raised a voice. No one struck anyone into place. The absence of cruelty made Margaret tense, as if the real blow were still being carefully prepared. They were standing there when the officer approached. She was a woman, not much older than Margaret herself, her uniform pressed and clean, her hair pinned neatly beneath her cap. She walked with purpose but without haste, stopping in front of the group and looking at them not as a mass, but as individuals. When she spoke, it was in German. "Welcome to Camp Concordia," she said carefully with a slight American accent that softened the words rather than distorting them. "You are prisoners of war of the United States Army." Margaret felt Elsa's hand tighten in hers. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," the officer continued. "You will receive food, shelter, and medical care. You will be expected to follow camp rules. You will be assigned work. You will be paid." The words landed one by one, each more confusing than the last. Medical care. Paid. "You may write letters home," the officer added. "They will be censored. You may receive mail. If you are ill or injured, you will report it. You will not be punished for asking for medical attention." She paused, scanning their faces. "Any questions?" No one spoke. A woman near the end of the line began to shake, silent tears running down her cheeks. Margaret stared straight ahead, her mind struggling to reconcile the calm voice in front of her with everything she had been taught to expect. "It's a trick," Elsa murmured under her breath. "It has to be." Margaret wanted to agree. She nodded, though the certainty she needed did not come. They were led next toward a low building marked with a red cross. The symbol made Margaret's heart race. Hospitals were not places of safety in the stories she knew. They were places where people disappeared. Inside, the air changed immediately. It was cool, clean, and smelled faintly of disinfectant. White walls reflected the light evenly, without shadows to hide in. American nurses moved between stations with clipboards in hand, their motions efficient and impersonal. No one looked angry. No one looked pleased. They looked busy. One by one, the women were called forward. Hair was examined, mouths checked, hands and feet inspected. Questions were asked in short, direct sentences and answered with nods or shakes of the head. Everything was written down. When it was Margaret's turn, she sat where she was told and stared at the wall while gloved hands moved through her hair. "Any pain?" the nurse asked. Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. The nurse nodded and made a note. "Delousing," she said, pointing toward a door. "Then shower." The word sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with temperature. Shower meant undressing. It meant exposure. It meant humiliation. She followed the others toward the tiled room with a tightness in her chest that made it hard to breathe. Steam hung in the air. Shower heads lined one wall in neat rows. For a moment, no one moved. A middle-aged American woman stood near a bench stacked with folded towels and clothing. She held out a bar of soap toward Margaret. "Hot water," she said in careful German. "Take your time." The soap was smooth and pale. When Margaret lifted it to her nose without thinking, a scent bloomed that she had not smelled in years. Lavender. Her hands began to shake. She stepped under the water, half expecting it to turn cold, to burn, to stop without warning. Instead, it poured down steadily, warm and abundant, soaking her hair, her skin, the grime that had clung to her for months. Margaret pressed her forehead against the tiled wall and closed her eyes. She did not sob. She did not cry out. Tears came quietly, mixing with the water as something inside her gave way. She felt exposed, not because she was naked, but because the world was not behaving as it was supposed to. Cleanliness felt undeserved. It felt dangerous. When she emerged wrapped in a towel, clean clothes waited on the bench. They were plain, sturdy dresses, not uniforms, not rags. They smelled of soap and sun. Elsa came out moments later, her eyes red, her face stripped of its usual control. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. Afterward, they were marched to the mess hall. The building was long and wooden, with windows along both sides that let in the late afternoon light. Inside, rows of tables stretched across the room, already set. At the far end, American cooks worked behind a counter, ladling food onto metal trays with practiced ease. The smell was overwhelming now. Margaret took a tray with hands that trembled and looked down at it in disbelief. Mashed potatoes, pale and smooth, butter melting into soft pools on top. A thick slice of meatloaf, green beans, white bread, and a cup filled with dark liquid that smelled bitter and rich. They sat down together, the women from the cattle car, their trays untouched. No one ate. They stared at the food as if it might change shape if they blinked. "Poison," someone whispered. "A test," another suggested. Margaret picked up her fork and set it down again, her pulse loud in her ears. Around them, American soldiers ate the same meal at nearby tables. The same portions, the same bread. This, more than anything else, made no sense. Finally, Margaret lifted her fork once more. She took a small bite of potatoes and brought it to her mouth. The taste was real. She swallowed, stunned, and looked at Elsa, who was already crying silently as she chewed. Margaret did not understand what she was seeing. She only knew that the evidence sat warm and solid in front of her, asking questions she did not yet know how to answer. The days at Camp Concordia settled into a rhythm so quickly that it frightened Margaret. A bell rang each morning at 6. Not a scream, not a curse hurled down a corridor, just a clear sound that cut through sleep and demanded attention. They dressed, lined up, answered their names. The process was efficient, almost dull. Breakfast followed, oatmeal, toast, sometimes eggs, and then work assignments were read aloud. Margaret and Elsa were sent to the laundry. The building was hot even in early autumn, steam rising from the vats where uniforms soaked and churned. The work was heavy. Wet fabric weighed down their arms, and the smell of soap clung to their skin long after the shift ended. But it was work with edges and limits. The hours were counted. Breaks were allowed. At the end of the day, they were dismissed, not collapsed. Once a week, they were paid. 80 cents, counted carefully into each woman's hand. American coins, worn smooth by other lives, other pockets. Margaret turned them over in her palm the first time, staring at the unfamiliar faces stamped into metal. Money meant choice. Choice meant dignity. Neither concept sat comfortably with what she believed captivity should be. With the coins came the canteen. It was a small building near the center of the camp, its shelves stocked with items that felt impossibly extravagant. Soap in different scents, writing paper, stamps, cigarettes, chocolate bars wrapped in brown paper with English words printed boldly across them. The first time Margaret bought one, her hands shook. She took the bar back to the barracks and sat on her bunk, turning it over and over in her fingers. The wrapper crinkled softly, the sound loud in the quiet room. She did not open it. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Chocolate had once been a childhood pleasure, something shared on birthdays or holidays. During the war, it had become a rumor, a memory spoken about with disbelief. Now it sat in her hand, earned with American money for American work, and the thought of eating it made her stomach twist. Somewhere in Bremen, her mother was likely cold, hungry, counting ration cards that no longer stretched far enough. Margaret set the chocolate beside her and folded her hands in her lap. Sweetness felt dangerous now. It felt like theft. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. The envelope was thin, the paper inside almost translucent. Her mother's handwriting slanted unevenly across the page, the letters smaller than Margaret remembered, as if the act of writing itself had become an effort to conserve strength. Bremen was in ruins. Their building had been destroyed in a raid. Her mother was living in a cellar with 6 other families. There was no coal. Furniture had been burned for heat. Food came only with ration cards, and the rations had been cut again. Water had to be carried from a pump 2 blocks away. "I am glad you are safe," her mother wrote. "Wherever you are, it must be better than here." Margaret read the sentence twice before the words registered. The guilt hit her like a fist. It knocked the air from her lungs and folded her forward on the bunk, the letter crumpling in her hands. She pressed her face into the thin blanket to keep from making a sound. Around her, other women were reading their own letters, some crying openly now, no longer ashamed of it. Elsa found her an hour later, curled on her side, eyes swollen and red. "From home?" Elsa asked gently. Margaret nodded. They sat together without speaking. Outside, the camp continued on schedule. Lunch was served. Guards changed shifts. Somewhere, a radio played. That was what unsettled Margaret most. The Americans did not seem to notice the moral imbalance that consumed her. They did not lower her portions. They did not avert their eyes. They continued to do their jobs with the same quiet consistency as before. In the laundry, a guard named Tommy sometimes worked nearby, overseeing the intake of uniforms. He was young, with freckles across his nose and an easy grin that appeared without effort. "Good morning," he would say in careful German. "Thank you." "You are welcome." He practiced the words as if they amused him, repeating them until the sounds came out right. Once he asked Margaret how to say his name properly in her language. When she corrected his pronunciation, he laughed and tried again. She watched him closely, waiting for the cruelty she had been promised to surface. It never did. She noticed other things instead. Guards rubbing their eyes during long shifts, letters being read and reread during breaks, conversations about places she had never seen, Kansas farms, Michigan lakes, mothers waiting back home. They missed people. They worried. They complained about the cold coming too early that year. They were not monsters. At night, the barracks filled with whispered conversations. The stove in the center glowed softly, radiating heat that felt almost indulgent. Some women lay awake staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep in a bed that was not a floor. "This is psychological warfare," one of the older women insisted one evening. "They are trying to make us soft." "By feeding us?" another asked quietly. "By keeping us warm?" "Yes," the first replied sharply. "That is how they break us. They make us forget who we are." Margaret listened without speaking. "Or maybe," the schoolteacher said from her bunk, her voice calm, "this is simply how they live." The words hung in the air, unwelcome and undeniable. No one answered her. Margaret thought about the order of the camp, the predictability, the way systems seemed to function without needing fear to enforce them. People did their jobs because they were supposed to, not because someone stood over them with a weapon. A society running on routine and trust. She did not know what to do with that idea. As September turned to October, the weather cooled. Sweaters were issued. Proper shoes replaced worn ones. Coal arrived for the stoves without anyone having to beg for it. Heat became another expected thing, as regular as the morning bell. Margaret wrote to her mother but tore up the letter twice before sending it. She could not find a way to describe her days without sounding cruel. How do you explain eating 3 meals a day to someone who is starving? Elsa began to complain of stomach pain around that time. At first, she brushed it off. "Probably nothing," she said, waving away Margaret's concern. "Something I ate?" She continued to work, lifting wet uniforms, tying them onto lines, her face pale but determined. When Margaret pressed her, Elsa smiled thinly. "It will pass," she said. "It always does." Margaret wanted to believe her, but at night, as Elsa shifted restlessly on the bunk above, one hand pressed against her abdomen, Margaret stared into the darkness and felt the slow, creeping fear return. Not the fear of cruelty, the fear that kindness had made her unprepared for what pain still could do, and that frightened her more than any barbed wire ever had. Elsa insisted on finishing her shift. The pain had started as a dull pressure low in her abdomen, something she tried to ignore by tightening her jaw and keeping her hands busy. She moved more slowly than usual that morning, her steps careful, her shoulders stiff. When Margaret asked if she wanted to report to the infirmary, Elsa shook her head. "It's nothing," she said. "I don't want trouble." Trouble had become an old instinct, one that survived even kindness. Elsa bent over the steaming vats, lifted wet uniforms, wrung them out with arms that trembled despite her effort to keep them steady. Sweat beaded along her hairline even though the room was cool. By mid-morning, her face had gone pale. She leaned against the concrete basin, breathing shallowly, one hand pressed flat against her stomach. Margaret noticed the way Elsa's fingers curled inward, as if bracing against something inside herself. "You need to stop," Margaret said. "This isn't right." Elsa opened her mouth to argue and never finished the sentence. Her knees buckled without warning. The sound her body made when it hit the floor was dull and final, a sound Margaret had learned to fear. Water sloshed over the edge of the basin. Someone screamed Elsa's name. Margaret was on the ground beside her before she realized she had moved. Elsa's eyes rolled back, then focused again with effort. Her breathing came fast and shallow, each inhale a small, sharp sound that seemed to cut her chest open. Margaret slid her hand under Elsa's back and felt warmth spreading through the fabric of her dress. Blood. Too much of it. Margaret tore off her own apron and pressed it hard against Elsa's abdomen, her hands slick and shaking. The cloth darkened immediately. The smell of iron filled the room. "Stay with me," Margaret said, though she could hear how thin her voice sounded. "Stay with me?" Elsa's lips moved. No sound came out. Margaret's mind raced, searching for what came next, for what she had been taught to do in moments like this. Images rose unbidden. Field hospitals abandoned during retreat. Wounded men left behind because transport was needed elsewhere. The whispered rule everyone knew. Do not waste medicine on those who will not return to the fight. Do not waste time on the enemy. Mercy is ending it quickly. Her chest tightened as the conclusion formed with terrible clarity. Elsa was dying, and dying slowly was cruel. Margaret looked up at the other women gathered around them, their faces frozen in horror, and made her decision. "I'll get help," she said. She did not say what kind. She stood and ran. The distance to the guard post felt impossibly long. The yard blurred around her as she sprinted, her boots slipping on gravel, her breath tearing painfully at her lungs. She did not slow when someone shouted after her. She did not stop to think. The words formed in her head as she ran, heavy and certain. "Shoot her. End it. Be merciful." She slammed her hands against the guard post door once, twice, again, until it flew open. "Please," she gasped, the world narrowing to the face in front of her. My friend, dying. The soldier stared at her, confusion giving way to alarm as he took in her blood-stained hands, her wild eyes. "Shoot her," Margaret said. "Please. Mercy." For a split second she expected anger, laughter, disgust. Instead, the soldier's expression hardened into something else entirely. He reached for his radio. "Medical emergency," he said sharply. "Laundry building. Now." The siren cut through the air almost immediately. Margaret flinched at the sound, a reflex born of too many nights spent under falling bombs. But this siren did not carry dread. It carried motion. The soldier was already moving, waving her forward, his focus absolute. "Show me," he said. They ran together. By the time they reached the laundry building, 2 medics were already there, a stretcher unfolding between them. They moved fast, their voices low and clipped, hands steady as they assessed Elsa's condition. Margaret dropped to her knees beside Elsa again, taking her hand. Elsa's fingers twitched weakly in response. "She's bleeding internally," one medic said to the other. "Likely ruptured appendix." Without discussion, they lifted Elsa onto the stretcher. An IV needle slid into her arm with practiced ease. Clear fluid began to drip steadily into her vein. Blankets were wrapped around her, tucking her in as if she were something precious. Margaret stared, stunned. No one questioned whether Elsa deserved this. They wheeled the stretcher out into the open air and toward the waiting ambulance. Margaret followed blindly, her hands still stained red, her mind struggling to keep pace with what was happening. Inside the ambulance, the space was tight and loud with motion. The doors slammed shut. The engine roared to life. The vehicle lurched forward, tires grinding against gravel. Margaret sat on the bench seat, gripping Elsa's hand with both of hers. The medic adjusted the IV, checked Elsa's pulse, called out numbers Margaret did not understand. Elsa's eyes fluttered open. "Margaret," she whispered, the word barely audible. "I'm here," Margaret said immediately. "You're not alone." "Why?" Elsa breathed. "Why are they?" Margaret swallowed hard. "I don't know," she said, "but they are." The ambulance swayed as it picked up speed, the siren continuing its relentless call. Margaret felt her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, loud and unsteady, as if it might burst out of her chest. They arrived at the hospital in a rush of motion and light. Doors flew open, hands reached in. Elsa was lifted and carried away down a corridor marked with red letters Margaret could not read. Margaret tried to follow and was gently stopped by a nurse who guided her toward a small waiting room. "You stay here," the nurse said, her tone firm but not unkind. "They'll take care of her." The doors to the operating room swung shut with a sound that echoed in Margaret's bones. She sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs, her legs giving out beneath her. Her hands rested in her lap, still sticky with Elsa's blood. She stared at them without blinking. Time stretched. Minutes passed, then hours, though it felt like neither. A guard sat across from her, saying nothing, his presence solid and strangely comforting. He offered her a cup of coffee at some point. She took it without tasting it. Her eyes kept returning to the clock on the wall. The second hand moved with unbearable slowness, each tick a reminder that Elsa's life was being measured somewhere behind closed doors. This was not how mercy was supposed to look. Mercy, she had been taught, was quick, final, clean. This was something else entirely. Margaret pressed her palms together and waited, suspended between everything she had believed and everything she was being shown. The doors remained closed, and all she could do was sit there, hands stained, heart racing, counting seconds as if they were the last she would ever know. Time did not move normally in the waiting room. It stretched, thinned, lost its shape. The clock on the wall marked the hours with indifferent precision, but Margaret felt each minute separately, as if it had weight. 1 hour passed, then another. The doors to the operating room stayed closed. She sat rigid in her chair, hands folded together so tightly her fingers ached. Dried blood darkened the skin around her nails. She noticed it, registered it, and then looked away, afraid that if she focused on it too long she would break apart. After the first hour, she told herself that this was already more than she had expected. After 3, she began to understand that something extraordinary was happening. No one had come out to say it was over. No one had told her to prepare herself. At 6 hours, she stopped counting. The waiting room was small and plain. Plastic chairs lined the walls. A rack of old magazines sat untouched in the corner. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. People came and went quietly, their footsteps soft on the linoleum floor. An American guard sat a few chairs away from her. His name tag read Davis. He was older than most of the soldiers Margaret had seen, his hair already touched with gray. He watched the hallway more than he watched her, as if this, too, were simply part of his duty. At some point, he stood and returned with 2 paper cups. "Coffee," he said, holding one out to her. Margaret hesitated. Her hands shook as she took it. The cup was warm, almost hot, and the smell rose up sharply. Bitter. Real. She took a small sip without thinking and grimaced. Davis smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "Hospital coffee." She nodded, unsure what else to do. They sat in silence after that. The clock ticked. Somewhere, down the hall, a cart rattled. A door opened and closed again. Families waited in the room now. An older couple sat together, heads bent close. A woman paced slowly, her arms wrapped around herself. They glanced at Margaret from time to time, curiosity flickering across their faces when they noticed her clothes, her guarded posture. No one stared, no one moved away. After a while, a woman approached her, holding a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "You look hungry, dear," she said gently. Margaret froze. Hunger was a complicated thing now. It carried guilt with it, and shame, and a sense that accepting care meant accepting something she did not deserve. But the woman's eyes were kind, and waiting felt easier than refusing. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. She ate without tasting much, aware of the strange normality of the moment. A German prisoner. An American waiting room. Shared food. Davis spoke again after some time, his voice low. "Your friend," he said. "You've known her long?" "Since we were girls," Margaret answered. "Bremen." He nodded. "That's a long time." "Yes." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "My daughter's about your age," he said after a moment. "She's a nurse, over in France." The words settled between them. His daughter was caring for wounded men somewhere far away, men who might have been shooting at Germans like Elsa only weeks before. "This war," Davis went on quietly, "it's a mess." Margaret did not know what to say to that. In Germany, such words were dangerous. Here they were spoken aloud, unguarded. Hours passed. Margaret drifted in and out of a numb awareness, her thoughts looping back to Elsa on the floor of the laundry building, to the warmth spreading through fabric, to the decision she had made. She wondered how close she had come to ending her friend's life with her own words. At last, footsteps approached down the hall, heavier and more deliberate than the others. Margaret looked up. The surgeon stood in the doorway, his mask pulled down around his neck, his surgical gown marked with dark stains. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot but steady. He scanned the room once before his gaze found hers. "She's alive," he said. The words hit Margaret like a physical force. Her legs gave out. She sat down hard, barely aware of the chair beneath her. Tears blurred her vision, but she did not try to stop them. They came hot and sudden, carrying with them something that felt like release. The surgeon walked closer and sat in the chair beside her, still wearing his stained gown. "It was bad," he said simply. "Ruptured appendix. Infection had already spread. We had to clean out the abdominal cavity completely. It took time." "How long?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "Almost 8 hours." 8 hours. 8 hours of skilled hands and focused attention. 8 hours of American medicine, American blood, American effort poured into saving a German prisoner. "Another hour," the surgeon continued, "and we would have lost her." Margaret pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you." The surgeon shook his head gently. "It's what we do." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and spoke the words that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "All lives have value." The sentence landed with a weight that Margaret had never felt before. All lives, not useful lives, not obedient lives, not lives that served a cause, just lives. In that moment, something inside her collapsed, not in pain, but in recognition. An entire structure of belief, built carefully over years of repetition and fear, gave way under the simple force of truth demonstrated by action. The Reich had taught her that worth was measured by blood, by loyalty, by usefulness to the state, that enemies were less than human, that mercy was weakness. But this man had just spent 8 hours disproving every one of those ideas. Margaret nodded, unable to speak, as the surgeon stood and led her down the corridor. They stopped briefly outside the recovery room. Elsa lay on the bed inside, pale but breathing steadily, tubes running into her arms, bandages covering her abdomen. She was alive. Margaret took her friend's hand and felt warmth there, solid and real. The surgeon left her then, returning to his duties without ceremony. There were other patients, other lives. Margaret sat beside Elsa and let the truth settle slowly, painfully into place. America had not saved her friend because it was easy. It had saved her because it believed it should. In the middle of a war that demanded everything, factories running day and night, families rationing, young men sent across oceans, this country had still chosen to draw a line it would not cross. Strength, Margaret realized, did not require cruelty. Discipline did not require hatred. And mercy, when practiced without exception, was not weakness at all. It was a kind of victory she had never been taught to recognize. By the time she left the hospital, escorted quietly back toward the camp, Margaret understood that she would never again see the world in the way she had before. Something essential had shifted, not because someone had told her what to believe, but because she had watched an enemy prove it. Elsa stayed in the hospital for 12 days. Margaret was allowed to visit her every afternoon, always escorted, always at the same hour. The routine became familiar quickly. Down the corridor, past the nurse's station, into the quiet room where Elsa lay recovering. Each day she looked a little less pale. Each day her breathing sounded stronger. A young nurse named Betty often lingered after checking Elsa's chart. She spoke in simple German, carefully chosen words that sometimes came out wrong, but always kindly. "How is the pain today?" she would ask. Elsa would smile faintly. "Better," she said. "Still hurts, but I am alive." Betty laughed softly. That's the important part. They talked about small things, the weather, the food, Betty's cat back home, ordinary subjects that did not belong to enemies. Margaret sat quietly beside the bed, listening, absorbing the strange normality of it all. On the 4th day, Elsa woke fully and looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "They didn't shoot me," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Margaret squeezed her hand. "No." "They saved me." "Yes." Elsa closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again, tears gathering at the corners. 8 hours, she whispered. "They told me." Margaret nodded. There was nothing else to add. When Elsa was finally released and returned to Camp Concordia, the women gathered around her bed that first evening. They listened without interrupting as Elsa described the ambulance, the surgery, the nurses who changed her bandages, the surgeon who came twice a day to check on her progress. No one argued. No one dismissed it as a trick. They sat in silence afterward, the weight of the story settling over the barracks like a shared breath. The next morning, Margaret wrote to her mother. She did not know how much the censor would allow through, but she wrote anyway, slowly and carefully. "Mutti," she began, "I have seen something here that I cannot explain easily. The enemy treats us like people. When my friend nearly died, they did not let her go. They fought for her life. They used their medicine and their skill for her. Even though she is German, I am safe. I am fed. I am warm. I do not know what this means yet, but I know I will never forget it." She folded the letter and handed it over, unsure whether it would ever reach Bremen, unsure whether her mother could believe what she was reading. Years passed. The war ended. Camp Concordia closed. Margaret and Elsa returned to a Germany that barely resembled the one they had left. They built lives among the ruins, raising children in a country learning how to live with its past. But the memory did not fade. Every year, on the anniversary of Elsa's surgery, she lit a candle. Sometimes she did it alone. Sometimes her children stood beside her, curious but respectful. "For whom?" they would ask. "For a man I never met," Elsa would answer. "For a doctor who did not have to save me." She never knew his name. She never saw him again. But she remembered his words, and the truth behind them. All lives have value. When her grandchildren were old enough to ask about the war, Elsa told them the story. Not about battles or uniforms or flags. She told them about a hospital in Kansas, about waiting rooms and coffee cups, about 8 hours of quiet determination. "Why did he help you?" one of them asked once. Elsa thought for a long moment before answering. "Because that is who they chose to be," she said. "History remembers battles, it remembers dates and victories and losses, but people remember who treated the helpless with dignity. The legacy of those 8 hours did not belong to a single nation or a single uniform. It lived on in the understanding passed from one generation to the next, in the knowledge that strength could take a gentler form, and that mercy, practiced with discipline, could shape lives long after the war was over. Sometimes Margaret wondered what America had become since then. She wondered if the country still remembered that version of itself, the one that had chosen restraint when it could have chosen indifference. She hoped it did, because for her, and for Elsa, and for the children who came after them, that was the America worth remembering.